So today we're going to do a lecture on geologic time. The next two topics are focused around the history, evolution, and development of the Earth. We will review how to put rock layers and geologic events like faults and folds in chronological order based on principles of dating. We will discuss how to determine how old rock layers and fossils are using radioactive dating. We will also examine how life on Earth has evolved over time, including how oceans and the atmosphere developed. We will begin by looking at rock layers and geologic events such as faulting, folding, or igneous intrusions. We will work to determine the order in which such geologic events happened and the timing of when rock layers formed. So sediments are deposited in layers, with the oldest layers being the ones that were deposited first. So you see this lighter gray colored sediment is poured into this glass. And then later, you have this reddish orangey color sediment poured on top of that. And then later on, you have this darker gray sediment poured on top of all that. So when you look at the third glass, the one that was poured first is at the bottom. So that's the oldest. The most recently poured sediment is at the top, and that's going to be your youngest layer. It's similar also to snow that falls in layers. So the layer at the bottom fell first, and then as time goes by, more layers are on top of it. So the layer on top is the most recent layer of snow. So when we look at a series of rock layers, we can determine which are the youngest layers and which are the oldest. When we describe geologic events, such as deposition of sediment and the formation of rock layers, or igneous intrusions, or folding or faulting, when we describe these events in chronological order compared to other geologic events, we are assigning what we call relative ages. So in this diagram here, we know at the top, layer A is younger. It was deposited more recently. And then if you're going to compare that to layer B is older, layer A is younger relative to each other. So A is younger than B. B is older than A. Notice how we don't know how old they are in numbers. We don't have specific number ages. We just know younger versus older. So that's relative dating, relative ages. So relative dating involves determining the chronological order of geologic events. Again, these events could be sediment deposition, faulting, folding, igneous intrusions, things like that. It does not involve actual ages though. So that's like this person here asking their friend, hey, how old are you? And the friend's response is, I'm older than my sister and younger than my brother. So there's no age, there's no numbers involved. It's a discussion of comparison. Just as an example. I don't think people really answer questions like that about how old they are. Okay, so these are some principles that we use in relative dating. So we have the principle of original horizontality. That tells us that all sediments are initially deposited in horizontal layers. Then we have the principle of superposition. sedimentary rock layers that have not been disturbed lie in order of how they were deposited. The oldest rock layers are on the bottom and the more recent deposits are on top. And when we're talking about disturbances, we're talking about faulting, folding, being overturned, things like that. So if the rock layers were not folded, faulted, things like that, then we could use the principle of superposition and say the youngest layers are on top, the oldest are on the bottom. Then we have the principle of lateral continuity. Sedimentary rock layers are deposited in continuous layers and can thus be correlated with nearby deposits. So when we look at this rock layer that I'm pointing to with the yellow arrows, the first arrow to the left is pointing to a particular rock layer. And then if you trace that rock layer all the way to this yellow arrow, it's pointing to the same layer. So we're going to assume that the rock over here by the yellow arrow to the right, we're going to assume that's the same age as the rocks next to the yellow arrow to the left. Okay, these are the same age rocks. And that's because we're seeing that it is continuous. It's one continuous rock layer. Now this gets important as a principle later on, we'll see. But let's say you had some sort of large canyon here with all these rocks in the middle missing from erosion. And then you see this rock layer and this rock layer. You could still assume that they're the same age, even if you don't see that it's a continuous line. Okay, and you can see that more if you look at the top here. This rock layer here is most likely the same age as this rock layer here behind the tree. You can't really see it. You could see it a little bit. Okay, because it used to be continuous laterally. You just had erosion that removed the part in the middle. Okay, but it's all the same age going across. That's the principle of lateral continuity. So here's a picture of the principle of original horizontality. I've shown you this photo before, but it's a really good example because you see a lot of rock layers in here and they're all horizontal. The sediments were deposited in these horizontal layers and they were not disturbed. So that's the original horizontality. Here's an example of lateral continuity, another example. So here is this rock layer, this blue outline. This is the same rock layer. This is the same rock layer. So these sections could be really far apart from each other. But we're assuming that this is the same rock layer because it has the same properties, the same grain size, the same color. Let's say, you know, it has all the same properties. And we could assume that it used to all be a continuous line and then you just had erosion remove the rocks in the middle. Because it used to all be continuous because that is how sediment is deposited. Like this. Okay, so here is a sedimentary basin where sediment is accumulated. See, it's all just continuous layers. And then it turns into sedimentary rock. And then here later on, you may have had erosion. So this reddish purple layer here is the same age as this layer here. This bluish purple on the bottom is the same age going across, and this pink color goes across same age, because we're taking the lateral continuity concept and just assuming that erosion removed the rocks in the middle. Well, erosion did remove the rocks in the middle, but we're assuming that these rock layers are the same. They used to be continuous. Then we have the principle of cross-cutting relationships. So in this photo, you have a fault line. So the concept of cross-cutting relationships says that if there's something that happened to the rock layers, then when you compare ages of the event to the ages of the rock layers themselves, like how old the rock layers are, the event is always younger. What that means is these rock layers formed and existed, and then the fault line affected the rocks. So the fault line is younger than the formation of these rock layers that were faulted. Okay, so rock layers need to be in existence in order for them to be faulted, folded, or fractured. So faults are always younger or more recent events than the formation of the rock layers that were faulted. Igneous intrusions, okay, we're gonna talk about igneous intrusions now. Igneous intrusions can only intrude rocks that already exist. So igneous intrusions like dikes and sills are always younger than the rocks they intrude. And contact metamorphism can only affect rocks that already exist. Okay, so those are all events that are going to be more recent than the formation of the rocks that they affect. Okay, so in the top diagram, you're looking at these rock layers and then this igneous dike. So the igneous dike is younger than the rock layers that it intruded. And then here is an igneous pluton. The rock layers were already there. The pluton caused a baked contact, which is really contact metamorphism. So the green like fuzzy looking outline around the pluton is contact metamorphism. So the pluton and the contact metamorphism are younger or more recent events than the formation of these rock layers. Then we have the principle of inclusions. Fragments included in a rock are older than the rock itself. The rock fragments had to be formed before they could be incorporated into another rock. So here is a sketch of a conglomerate. The pebbles in the conglomerate are older than the conglomerate rock itself. Now, when I think of this example, I think of chocolate chip cookies, because in order to make the chocolate chip cookie, you have to have the chocolate chips in existence in order for them to go into the cookie. So the chocolate chips are always going to be older than the chocolate chip cookie that you make. So the same thing with conglomerate. The pebbles have to exist in order for them to go into making the conglomerate rock. So here is a conglomerate, a picture of a conglomerate, right? So the pebbles are all older than the conglomerate rock itself. So rock layers show us a record of the geologic history of an area. Sedimentary rock layers indicate depositional environments, for example. And you can go back to the sedimentary rocks lecture where we talked about certain rock types indicating that they were formed in a deep ocean. Some rock layers formed near the beach or close to the coast. Stuff like that. So the type of sediment and the different features related to the sediments tell us about the environment that the sediments were deposited in. Metamorphic rocks indicate different events like mountain building, or maybe there was contact metamorphism related to a lava flow. And igneous layers include intrusions and lava flows or volcanic ash deposits, which tell us about the igneous activity in an area. And then also fossils mark different periods of time. So when you look at rock layers, there's a lot of information about the geologic history that happened in an area. But not all of the rocks from all of geologic history are going to be present because you have erosion. So erosion removes a lot of material as well. So we just have to go with what we have available in the rock record. Okay, but keep in mind there's a lot of erosion that has removed a lot of the geologic history evidence from different areas. So an unconformity is a break in the geologic record caused by erosion. Sometimes unconformities, rather than being related to erosion, it also may be a period of time that did not have sediment accumulate. Okay, so maybe there was just time periods where you didn't really have deposition happening. Okay, but many times it is related to erosion removing rock layers. If more sediments are deposited on top of the erosional surface, then there will be a missing time period in the rock record, which we call a hiatus. Okay, so the break in the geologic record related to the erosion is called the unconformity. So step one, over here, you have sedimentary rock layers. Step two, you have some erosion that happened. And then step three, you have more deposition on top of the erosional surface. So this right here is your unconformity, because you're missing a time period. You're missing that sediment that was eroded away. There are three different types of unconformities: a disconformity, an angular unconformity, and a non-conformity. So a disconformity is gonna look something like this, where it's all flat, parallel sedimentary layers. But you have a missing time period. Okay, so disconformities, all the rock layers are going to be parallel, flat sedimentary layers, but you'll have a missing time period. That's because you had erosion and then more sediment deposited later on. Disconformities can be difficult to recognize because it just looks like rock layers one on top of the other. But if you, for example, if you have fossils in the rock layers, you can use the fossils to determine if there's a disconformity, because you might have fossils that we know existed in one time period right next to right on top of rock layers that contain fossils from a completely different time period that happened like millions of years earlier, and then you might be missing a time period in between. Okay, so this is the transition process that leads to the formation of a disconformity. Okay, so here were some rock layers, then you have erosion, and then more sediment deposited later on. Now this could be like hundreds of millions of years, this process from time 1 to time 3. So you're missing hundreds of millions of years sometimes, or even more than that in your disconformity. Then we have angular unconformities. Angular unconformities form when rock layers are tilted or folded, and then erosion happens, and then more sediment layers are going to be deposited on top. So you have the older rock layers are either going to be tilted or folded, so they're going to be at a different orientation than the younger layers above. So in this case, these younger layers are flat, horizontal, but these layers are on a dip. They're dipping on an angle. So here's your angular unconformity right there. Okay, and then here's the timeline. Time 1, you have layers that are folded. Then you have erosion, remove some of the upper layers of the rock. And then later on, you have more sediment deposited. And that leaves you with your angular unconformity. This could either be folded layers like you see in the diagram, or it could be tilting like you see here. These rock layers are tilted. Okay, so they're tilted or folded, but they're at a different angle, oriented at a different angle than the sedimentary layers above. Then we have a non-conformity. This is when metamorphic or igneous bedrock is eroded and then sediments are deposited on top of the erosional surface. So when you look at this diagram here, you have granite that's 550 million years old. And then on top of the granite, you have sandstone. So the red line is showing you where the non-conformity is. Now, sometimes this may look like there was an igneous intrusion, like a sill, rather than a non-conformity. But then in that case, you would look for contact metamorphism. If there is contact metamorphism at this line here, then you know that this was a sill, which would actually be younger than the sandstone. Ignore the numbers for now. Okay, so if there were no numbers telling us how the age is, if this granite were an intrusion, there would have to be contact metamorphism here. In this case, there's no contact metamorphism, which indicates that the granite was already there, and then it eroded partly on top, and then sandstone was deposited on top. Okay? So this is a non-conformity, not a pluton that was in intrusion. Whoops. I'm just trying to go back to this. Okay, so here the pluton intruded into the sedimentary rock layers. You have contact metamorphism. But in the case that I just showed you, there's no contact metamorphism, so that tells us it's a non-conformity instead of an intrusion. Okay, so here is the timeline. You have the granite, then you had erosion, and then new sediment deposited on top. So now we're going to talk about how to decipher the geologic record with the help of fossils. So here are some examples of some fossils and some rocks. So this is a diagram that shows fossilization. So here you have this dinosaur that unfortunately collapsed and died right here. Here are some footprints. So eventually you have just the bones remaining. And then let's say the water level rises and new sediment is deposited on top of the dinosaur bones and the footprint. And then eventually you get more sediment layers deposited on top. Gradually the bones fossilize. And then here, a long time later, some geologist or paleontologist is looking at this rock layer here and sees some fossils and a little bit of a footprint impression sticking out here. So you have erosion later on that actually allowed for you to see some of those fossils. Not only erosion, but this may have been some sort of hill that was cut into to make a road. Actually, cutting into hills and mountains to make roads is actually a large part of why we're able to see rocks that we're able to, that normally would have been inside the middle of a hill or a mountain. Now they're exposed due to road cuts. So road cuts actually have helped geology as a science to progress because we're able to see a lot more rocks. So here are some common invertebrate fossils. Invertebrate means they do not have a backbone. So here are trilobites, bivalves, bryozoan. Here is a brachiopod, graptolite, coral. So we have the principle of fossil succession. We can study fossil assemblages, which are groups of fossil species found in rock layers. Sometimes there are fossil species that completely disappear from the rock record as you examine rock layers from older to younger. This indicates an extinction of a particular species. So if you're looking at rock layers going from older to younger, and then at some point there's a type of species that you never see again in the fossil record, it indicates an extinction. But you would have to examine different areas around the world. You know, other scientists would do the same studies, and then you would find that particular organism did not exist anymore after a particular time, and you would find it's consistent around the world, then that would indicate an extinction. So this, looking at the principle of fossil succession, we can look at the fossil assemblages in the rock layers. Okay, so here going from 1 to 10, these rock layers are oldest to youngest. Some of the rock layers contain more than one fossil species. And this is a list with pictures from A to F, A being the oldest, F being the youngest fossil species. Okay, so by examining the fossil assemblages, we can put the species in order of when they existed on Earth. And we talk about that in terms of ranges of existence. For example, bed 1 contains fossil A. Bed 2 also contains fossil A. Bed 3 and up do not contain fossil A. So that is interpreted to be that the time that fossil species A existed on Earth spanned the same time period of rock layer 1 and 2. So the bracket here is showing that that is the time range that this species existed for, because it's never seen in the fossil record after that. Okay, so this is the time range for fossil species A. And then you have fossil B only exists in rock layers 2 and 3. So that's the time range that this species existed on Earth. Okay, so these black lines in the brackets indicate the range that that species existed on Earth. Now, if you wouldn't necessarily use just one rock outcrop on one part of the Earth, right? You would probably want to also look at other rocks from around the world to see if it really is an extinction, like I said before. So we can now see that there is a definite sequence of the fossil species where A is the oldest species, then B, then C, D, E, and the species F is the most recent. Okay, because the older rocks contain A, B, and then as you go up in time, you get fossil C and then D, right? So we're seeing the succession from one species to the next, and we can put those fossils in order, youngest to oldest or oldest to youngest. We can then use specific fossils in relative dating of rocks that we find elsewhere. For example, if a geology student is hiking in the woods and finds a rock with fossil species A in it, and then later finds a different rock with fossil species E in it, the student can determine that the first rock with fossil species A is an older rock. Okay, so you can use the fossils to help you in relative dating. Here is a table showing ranges of when various species existed on Earth. The ranges are shown in these black lines. The top of the table, where it says period, and then there's all these words like Quaternary, Tertiary, Cretaceous. The words on top are more recent periods, and the words at the bottom are older periods. When you have the longer lines, it means that the species existed over a long period of time. Short lines tell us the species only existed for a short period of time. But keep in mind, when you say the word short, in geology, short could mean like 10 million years. Okay, so short is a different connotation in geology. Okay, so let's go over how to read this. So if a bird fossil, here's birds, a bird fossil is found in a rock, what is the oldest that rock could be? So yeah, the very, very end of the Jurassic, beginning of the Cretaceous, is when birds started to appear in the fossil record and come into existence. If you see also, humans have a short existence on Earth. Animals with shells have been around for a really long time. Fish, different type of fish, have been around for a very long time. Amphibians have been around for a very long time. Flowering plants have not been around for that long relative to other types of plants like mosses and ferns. Okay, so that's how you read this. You look at the black line, which is the range. So that brings us to index fossils. Index fossils are remains of organisms that are species that existed for a brief time period. But keep in mind, in geology, brief could mean like 10 million years. 20 million years is brief. Index fossils are also species that existed across a widespread area, such as across a large continent or like a part of a sea, maybe a species that lived widespread in a sea, like a particular species of plankton or something. Index fossils also have distinct identifiable features. So here is an example. A group of floating organisms called graptolites were common in some ancient seas that covered New York State at different times in the past. Rock layers that contain these fossils can be dated by knowing when graptolites existed. They only really existed for the time period between 485 million years ago to 358 million years ago. That's when graptolites existed. So that's a relatively small time period. So that means if you were to find a rock that has a graptolite fossil in it, you know that rock is between 485 million years old to 358 million years old. So index fossils act like a marker of time because that fossil species only existed a short period of time, so it marks that rock layer. Okay, so a rock layer with a graptolite fossil, like the one on the top of the page here, that's a graptolite fossil. We know this graptolite fossil and this rock must be somewhere between 485 and 358 million years old. It's kind of like a time capsule. Time capsules, you kind of like bury stuff that is trendy at a particular time. And then you write a note saying like, don't open until whatever year. And it could be like 30 years or 50 years in the future. And then someone opens it and they find like whatever you put in there. Okay, so if you were gonna do, you could put like toys that are popular, music that's popular, things like that, like go into a time capsule. Okay, so they mark time periods. So now we can start to correlate rock layers that are far from each other. We can match up similar rock types, especially with the help of fossils, if fossils are present. So down here, you have this area that shows you different rock layers. When the sediments that later formed these rock layers were deposited, they were in different parts of a sedimentary environment or a sedimentary basin. Okay, so here's rock layers from area C is up here. Here's where B is located, and here's where A is located. So when you look at the rock layers, you have this sandstone, this limestone, this sandstone, this conglomerate, etc. And then here are some fossils, X, Y, and Z. Your erosional surfaces that had deposition on top, which we call unconformities, are marked by this black squiggly line. So then what you do is you look at the patterns and you match the rock layers up. So this santoid sandstone is at the top and they all have the same fossil. So we're assuming those are the same rock layer. And then we look here, we see it's all continuous. It used to be all continuous in the past. But then A and B contain this limestone, but then C does not. And if you look at the picture down here, that limestone is missing from the area around C. So this just gives you more of an idea when you have rock layers showing, but you don't have continuous lines, like the lateral continuity is missing, you can still correlate the rock layers to each other. So here we can do that again. Whoops. So the principles of superposition, original horizontality, and cross-cutting relationships only allow for relative dating of events in the rock record at a single location. The principle of lateral continuity allows geologists to compare similar rock records in more than one location. So in this picture, you have outcrop A, outcrop B, and outcrop C. Outcrop A and B are 40 miles apart. Outcrop B and C are 35 miles apart. Okay, but because of lateral continuity, we know that the rock layers that we don't see in between used to be continuous. So we're going to start matching rock layers, matching patterns that we see between the three outcrops. When you match rocks of similar ages in different regions, it's called correlation. So we're looking for different sequences. So the first thing I noticed is that there was a volcanic ash layer. And I circled the volcanic ash layer with a red circle in each of the outcrops. And the volcanic ash layers may have been from a single volcanic eruption because these outcrops are not that far apart from each other. So if you had one volcano that erupted, you would have had ash like spread out far. So we're going to assume that the volcanic ash in all three outcrops is from the same volcanic eruption. So we could use that volcanic ash layer to interpret the rock events in all three locations. We can help like correlate between the three locations. What I mean by that is we can assume that these rock layers are the same age. Okay, so everything above the volcanic ash layer is younger than the volcanic ash layer in each outcrop. So everything above above in outcrop A is younger than the volcanic ash layer. Same with B and C. Everything below is older than the volcanic eruption. Okay, and that helps us because above the volcanic ash, you have tan limestone, conglomerate, brown sandstone, and tan siltstone. Now, what about in outcrop B? You have tan limestone and conglomerate. So those match, right? See how they match? So now we could say that those are probably the same rock layers that used to be continuous, because we're looking at the volcanic ash and then you look at whatever is above it and they match in terms of a sequence, the pattern matches, right? And then you look below and you have the green shale and the gray siltstone. So now we see that the entire outcrop pretty much matches between A and B. They both match these patterns. So now this whole entire section from the gray siltstone to the conglomerate matches this whole section from gray siltstone to conglomerate. And then we look on this side. We also have that tan limestone. And we also have the conglomerate. And then you look below, green shale and gray siltstone. Green shale. Gray siltstone. So now all of these rock layers match each other. So we're going to assume that they were all once continuous because of the principle of lateral continuity. So then there's a question here, which rock layer is the youngest and which is the oldest? So let's think about that.
Oh, I'm not sure. I mean, I obviously know that it's the last one, like on the bottom. It's either gray siltstone, black shale, or gray limestone, but I don't know between the three.
Okay, so if this gray siltstone is here, okay, so yeah, let's start with what you said. So here's gray siltstone. It matches with this gray siltstone. And then there are other rock layers that are even lower below the gray siltstone. And then when you look at this gray limestone, you see it matches with this because this red sandstone matches, this gray limestone matches. So what is the rock layer that's completely the lowest out of all of the rock layers? You have to kind of use the correlation and see like what's the furthest lower down than anything else.
So it's going to be black shale?
Yes. Yeah, that is correct. The black shale is going to be the oldest rock layer out of everything here. That is correct. Okay, and again, just to repeat, the gray siltstone matches up here, and then there's 3 other rock layers lower down. And then over here, there's 2 rock layers lower down. So you are correct in looking at the lowest, and then you have to see like which one's the ultimate lowest out of everything. Okay, so then we can see what the youngest rock layer is. And again, you would be looking on the top. So if this is conglomerate, that matches that conglomerate and that one. This is brown sandstone above the conglomerate. This conglomerate doesn't have brown sandstone on top. This conglomerate does have brown sandstone. Is there a rock layer further up above the brown sandstone?
No.
In any of the outcrops?
Tan siltstone.
Yeah, tan siltstone. The tan siltstone over here. Yeah, correct. That's good. Okay, so the tan siltstone is the youngest rock layer out of all of these. And the black shale is the oldest out of all of these.